I married 2 women nobody wanted. Here's what 20 years taught me. People ask me how a man ends up married twice to women the whole valley had given up on. I never know what to say to that. I guess the honest answer is, I didn't go looking. Both times, life just set something in front of me and I had sense enough not to walk away. I'm 63 years old. I've got a bad knee, a good dog, and more firewood stacked behind the barn than I'll burn in 2 winters. The ranch runs clean. The cattle are fat. And I've had 20 years of something most men I know never found once. I'm going to tell you both stories. Not because I'm proud exactly, though I am, but because I spent a long time thinking I was the kind of man nothing good happened to, and I turned out to be wrong about that. Maybe you have too. Start with Nora. The year was 1871. I was 39 years old and I had been alone on the Cutter Creek place for going on 6 years. Not counting before that there'd been a woman named Elsa who'd left in the spring of '65 while I was still in the war, took up with a feed merchant in Cheyenne, and I'd gotten word of it through a letter that took 4 months to reach me. By the time I read it, I was too tired to feel much of anything except a low kind of recognition, like I'd half expected it all along. The war was the thing I don't talk about much. Not because it was the worst of it. I've heard men talk about the war like it ate them up and didn't leave anything, and I understand that. But for me, it was just 4 years of cold and mud and work, and trying to get myself and the men beside me from one end of a thing to the other. I came out without a wound that showed and without a wound that buried me, and I came out in one piece, and that's more than I can say for some men I stood next to. There was a boy named Graver from Ohio who died at a crossing in '63 in about 4 inches of water, hit in the throat, and I was close enough that I got to him before he was gone but not close enough to do anything about it, and I held him while he finished, and that kind of thing doesn't leave you, but it also doesn't have to define you, and I've tried to make my peace with the distinction. You carry things and you work and you try to be useful to the people in front of you, and eventually the carrying gets lighter or you get stronger, and it amounts to the same. What the war did was it used me up in a way I didn't fully understand until afterward. I came back to Wyoming in the fall of '65 and I bought 40 acres from a man named Pollard who was pulling out for Oregon, and I built what I could build and ran what cattle I could afford and didn't ask for much. The work was enough. The work was everything. In those years I'd go from before sunup to past dark and fall into the bed and sleep without dreaming and wake up and do it again, and the days went by that way, and weeks, and seasons, and pretty soon years. I didn't think of it as hiding. It was just the way a man got through. 6 years of that. My nearest neighbor was 3 miles east, a man named Dewey Cass who was decent enough but who liked to talk, and most of what he talked about was the same things I didn't want to think about. The town of Haverford was 14 miles south. I went in when I needed to, and I came back when I was done. The first time I saw Nora Platt, she was carrying 2 buckets of water across the main street, one in each hand, and she had a bruise along her jaw that she wasn't hiding and wasn't explaining. She was 35, maybe, dark-haired, wide in the shoulder for a woman, and she walked like she was used to carrying weight and had made her peace with it. The buckets were headed toward the laundry on Elm Street, where she'd been working since her husband died. Her husband was Clyde Platt, who had been a drunk, and from what I understood, considerably worse than that. He died the previous winter, fallen through river ice while attempting to cross it in a state that made the crossing unwise. The town's feeling on the matter, which Haverford communicated the way small towns do, through tone and silence and the way people positioned themselves when she walked into a room, was that Nora had driven him to it, that she'd been difficult, cold, that a better wife might have kept him home and sober. I didn't know any of that the first time I saw her. I just saw a woman doing work that needed doing with no expression on her face, that asked for anything from anyone. I nodded. She didn't look up. That was October. I came into town the following February for salt and lamp oil and nails and a new draw knife, because I'd snapped the old one trying to square a timber in weather that was too cold for the wood to cooperate. I had a list and I was moving through it efficiently, which is how I did things then, in and out, no lingering, and I came around the corner by the hardware store and nearly walked into Nora Platt, who was standing in the street holding a paper. She looked at me. I said, "Beg your pardon." She said, "It's all right." Then she went back to looking at the paper. I could see from the angle that it was a bill of some kind, the kind of bill with large numbers and underlines. I don't know what made me stop. I'd already stepped around her and had 2 more items on the list. But something in the set of her made me stop. Not the bruise this time. There was no bruise, something else. She was standing very still in a way that wasn't calm, and I recognized the kind of stillness it was because I'd practiced it myself. I said, "Trouble." She folded the paper. Quick, precise, like she'd had practice folding things away, slipped it into the pocket of her coat. She said, "Nothing I can't manage." The way she said it was flat. Not angry, not sad. Just flat, the way you say something you've been saying to yourself for a long time and stopped believing. I said, "You work over at the laundry." She said she did. I said I had a load of linens I'd been meaning to bring in. Canvas work shirts mostly, and 3 wool blankets that had gotten past the point where I could pretend they weren't rank. A man alone doesn't always attend to those things the way he ought. She looked at me steadily. She wasn't pretty in any soft way. Her face was the kind that's been out in weather. But her eyes were clear and dark, and she was looking at me like she was deciding something, not about herself, about me. She said, "We charge by the pound." I said I'd bring them Thursday. She said, "Thursday's fine." I don't know if either of us thought it was anything more than what it was. Probably it wasn't. But I brought the linens Thursday, and when I came back for them on Saturday, she had them folded and wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, clean and precise, and there was a shirt on top of the pile that hadn't been in the load I'd brought. It was a shirt I'd left from a previous visit months before, old blue flannel. I'd lost track of it and given it up for gone. I said I didn't bring this. She said, "No, you left it in September. I've been holding it." It was a small thing, just a shirt, but she'd held it for months against my coming back for it, kept it separate, kept track. I don't know why that particular thing landed on me the way it did, but I stood there a moment longer than I needed to with a bundle of clean laundry in my arms, thinking about a woman who kept track of things other people walked away from. I said, "Much obliged." She nodded and turned back to work. I rode home in the cold and sat with the shirt in my hands for a while before I put it away. The next several months I'm going to take carefully, because if I rush through them, I'm not telling you the truth about how it happened. What happened wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where the sky opened. What there was Thursday after Thursday, which turned into me staying a few minutes longer each time, which turned into talking, which turned into me knowing more about her situation than I'd intended to know. Not because she told me too much too fast, but because she told me things plainly, in the same tone she used for everything, the way you state facts rather than complaints. The bill she'd been holding that day in February was for Clyde's debts. He died owing 3 men in Haverford significant amounts, a feed bill, a bar debt, and something more complicated involving a man named Turley who ran the livery and whose accounting I had reason to doubt. 2 of those men had come calling on Nora in the months after Clyde's death with the expectation that a widow's obligation was to stand behind her husband's word, and she'd agreed to it because she didn't have the legal footing to disagree, and because disputing men like that in Haverford in those years was not something a woman alone could do without consequences. The laundry job was covering her room at the boarding house and not much else. She'd been sending half her wages to those men for 8 months, and she had, by her calculation, another 14 months before she'd be clear. She told me this on a Thursday in March, sitting on a stool in the back of the laundry with a mangle going and steam in the air, and a pile of work shirts waiting, and she told it to me with no expectation attached. She was not telling me her troubles so I would fix them. She was telling me about her life because I had asked about it. That distinction mattered to me. I'd known women who told you their difficulties so you'd feel obligated, and I didn't blame them for it, but it wasn't something I trusted. What Nora did was different. She accounted for herself. Here is where I am. Here is what I owe. Here is what I'm doing about it. No appeal in it, no theater. I like that. I'd always liked people who accounted for themselves plainly. Over the next month or two, I began to see the rest of what she was. She had a dry humor she deployed rarely and precisely, usually when you'd given up expecting anything lighter than that flat voice. She remembered everything, what you'd said 3 weeks ago, what the weather had been, what price the flour had been in January. She had opinions about things that surprised me. She knew more about cattle prices than most of the men in the valley. She had views on the railroad situation that were more thought out than I'd have guessed. And she once said something about a land dispute that was quietly happening in the valley that turned out, 3 months later, to be exactly right. The town thought of her as damaged, soured. A woman whose husband had died badly, and who wore the blame for it in the way the town had arranged to hang it on her. What I saw was a woman who had carried a bad situation for years without complaint, kept her accounts, kept her word, and was working her way out of it 1 week's wages at a time. I started thinking about it. What I mean is, I started thinking about what I actually wanted, not what I'd told myself I wanted, which was to be left alone. What I actually wanted, which I hadn't asked myself directly in a long time. What I actually wanted was not to eat dinner by myself for the rest of my life. What I actually wanted was someone to talk to in the evenings. What I actually wanted was someone who kept track of things. Those are not glamorous reasons for marrying a woman. But they're honest ones, and at 39 years old with a ranch that worked and debts that were clear and 6 years of solitude, I was past the age of glamorous reasons. I asked her on a Thursday in May. I told her I had the Cutter Creek place and I ran it alone, and alone was not the most efficient arrangement. I could use help with it. I was not rich, but I was not encumbered. If she wanted to come out there as my wife, I would pay off what remained of Clyde's debts, and I would work her honestly and expect to be worked honestly in return, and I would not drink, and I would not raise my hand to her. Those were the things I could offer. I wasn't offering her comfort or ease, because I couldn't guarantee either of those. I was offering her a working partnership with a man who intended to behave like a decent one. She looked at me for a long time. The mangle ran behind her. Steam rose. Then she said, "Why me? There are women in this town who jump at a ranch and a man who doesn't drink." I thought about it honestly, because she deserved an honest answer. I said, "I'm not sure I'd do well with a woman who was jumping." It was the most honest thing I'd said to a woman since I couldn't remember when. It just came out. She studied me like she was trying to find the flaw in my argument, the angle I hadn't told her about. Then she said she'd think about it. She thought about it for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, she asked me 4 questions on 4 separate Thursdays, and I answered each one straight without dressing it up. The questions were, did I drink at all? Did I gamble? Had I been to a woman since my first wife left? And did I want children? I said no. Sometimes at cards, but never more than $2. No. And I didn't know that one would be up to the Lord and to her, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. On the 4th Thursday, she said yes. She said it quietly, without preamble, the way she said everything. I'd walked in to pick up a batch of overalls, and she had them wrapped and ready, and she handed them to me and said, "Yes, I'll come out to Cutter Creek." I said, "All right." I paid for the overalls. I probably should have said something more, but I didn't know what more to say, and I'd already learned that Nora didn't need things dressed up. We were married 2 weeks later on a Wednesday in June by the circuit preacher. Dewey Cass was witness. Nora wore a gray dress that I found out later she'd made herself from cloth she'd bought with her own wages. She hadn't asked me for it, hadn't mentioned needing it, just handled it the way she handled everything. And she pinned her hair up and came out of the boarding house with a small bag that was everything she owned. When the preacher asked if she took me, she said yes in a voice that didn't tremble and didn't hesitate, like a woman who had decided and was stating a decision. I thought whoever wrote off this woman was a fool. Now I need to tell you about the first year, because if I skip it, I'm not being honest. The first year was hard in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not hard the way I'd braced for. I'd half expected we'd grate on each other, two people who were set in their ways being suddenly set in the same house. What I'd braced for was friction, and there wasn't much friction. What there was instead was something harder to name. Both of us had been alone a long time. Both of us had been through things that had made us careful. We'd both built walls that worked fine for their purpose, and the trouble with walls that work fine is that you forget how to work without them. She worked, Lord, she worked. She had a back like iron and a will to match. She kept the house in a way I hadn't managed in 6 years, not fussy, not decorative, but functional and clean, and she had a memory for things that needed doing before they became problems. The root cellar got organized for the first time in 3 years. The smoke room was repaired. The chicken house, which I'd been intending to fix since the spring and hadn't gotten to, got fixed. She had opinions about the cattle, which surprised me. Her father had been a drover, I learned, and she knew more about cattle than she'd let on when we were talking over the counter at the laundry. We disagreed twice in the first month about which bulls to keep and which to cut. Both times she was right. I let her know that, because she was right and it seemed important to say so. But she didn't talk much in the evenings. Not to me. She'd talk to the dog and she'd talk to the horses in the barn and she'd murmur things to herself when she was working, but when we sat down after supper she was quiet. I was quiet too. We were both out of practice. The quietness was okay. It was not comfortable, but it was okay, the way new boots are not comfortable for the first months. I told myself it would take time. I told myself time was something I could give. What broke it, and I've thought about this a lot because it mattered, was the winter of that first year. November came in hard. We had a storm in the second week that was the worst I'd seen since before the war, 3 days of blowing snow and temperatures that dropped low enough to freeze the horses' breath before it left their nostrils. We got through that, got the cattle through it with losing only 2 head, which was better than I'd feared. Then we had 2 weeks of ordinary cold. Then in early December, another blizzard that pinned us in for 11 days straight. 11 days in a house that was, at the time, 2 rooms and a loft, and nothing to do but wait it out and keep the animals alive. By the 4th day, Nora was restless in a way that was almost painful to watch. She'd organized everything that could be organized. She'd mended everything that could be mended. She'd inventoried the root cellar and the pantry and the supply room, and made lists of what would need replenishing in spring. She sat by the fire on the afternoon of the 4th day with her hands in her lap, which I'd never seen her do, and she looked like a woman trying to hold herself very still against something. I said, "You all right?" She said, "I'm not used to having nothing to do." I said I had a deck of cards. She said she didn't play cards. I said I could teach her. She looked at me with an expression that I was starting to learn meant she was deciding whether something was worth her time, and then she nodded once. We played cards for 3 days. I taught her poker, which she took to immediately and with a competitive streak I found alarming. She watched how I held my face. She asked about probabilities. She thought several moves ahead in a way that made me suspect she'd been lying about not knowing how to play. By the 2nd day, she was winning most of the matchsticks. At some point during those 3 days, we started talking and didn't really stop. I found out she'd grown up in Missouri, that her father had been a good man but a restless one, moving the family from place to place following work, always one county over from something better. That she'd inherited both the goodness and the restlessness from him, and that marrying Clyde at 22 had been, in her own accounting, an attempt to anchor something that didn't want to be anchored. She'd married him thinking he was solid, and he'd been solid for about 8 months before the drink started showing what it really was. She talked about those years in the same flat voice she used for everything, not asking for sympathy, stating facts. She said she'd learned to go quiet inside herself. She said it was the only way she got through. I didn't have anything useful to add to that, so I listened, which seemed to be what was needed. I told her about Elsa. I'd never told anyone the full version. I told Nora all of it, the courtship, the marriage, the way things had seemed fine from where I was standing, the letter arriving at a camp in Virginia 4 months late, the particular shame of not having seen it coming, the 6 years after. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you bothered." 3 words. She said them looking at the fire, not at me. Not warm, not soft, just accurate. Like she was confirming something she'd been weighing. I sat with those words for a long time after. We settled into ourselves that winter. By spring, we'd found a rhythm. She'd figured out what kind of man I was and what to expect from me. I'd figured out that her quiet wasn't coldness, it was economy. She didn't spend words where they weren't needed, and when she spent them, they counted. The first summer was good. Not easy. The work of a cattle ranch is never easy, and it was a dry year, which put pressure on water and grass and required more moving of the herd than I'd have liked, but good. We built things together. Fixed the barn roof, which had needed doing for 2 years, and which I'd been not doing because fixing a barn roof alone is miserable and dangerous, and I'd kept finding reasons to put it off. She got up there with me without being asked and without comment, and we did it in a day. Cleared a section of new pasture I'd been meaning to get to. She started a kitchen garden that she managed like a small military campaign, and by August we had more vegetables than 2 people could eat, and she was putting things up in jars with the same efficiency she applied to everything. The cellar at the end of that summer was fuller than it had been in years, and I noticed it every time I went down into it, which was more often than necessary. In the evenings we sat. That was the thing I hadn't expected, the particular quality of evenings with another person in the house. I'd grown so accustomed to my own silence that I'd forgotten what it was like to have the light from another lamp in the room, the sound of pages turning, the small weight of a presence. It made the house different, not noisier, just less empty. We disagreed. We argued sometimes, and the arguments were real arguments, not performances. She had strong opinions and I had strong opinions, and occasionally they were different opinions, and we said so directly, which was the only way either of us knew how to do it. What I found was that arguing with Nora was like arguing with a man who was also right sometimes and wrong sometimes and knew the difference. She didn't shrink from a disagreement, but she also didn't argue to win. She argued to get to the right answer. Those are different things. Not every person knows the difference, and the ones who do are worth keeping close. The second year she told me she was expecting. I was standing at the stove when she said it. I remember the weight of the coffee pot in my hand, and the way the morning light was coming through the east window at a low angle, and I stood there for a moment not moving. Then I put the coffee pot down very carefully and I turned around. She was watching me with her clear dark eyes, and she had the expression she wore when she was measuring something. I said, "You're sure?" She said she was sure. I crossed the kitchen and I put my arms around her and I held on. She was stiff for a moment. She still got stiff sometimes when you moved on her too fast, and then she settled and put her arms around me in return, and we stood there in the kitchen with the coffee pot sitting on the cold stove. I said into her hair, "Thank you." She said after a moment, "That's a strange thing to thank me for." I said, "I know." Our boy Thomas was born in the spring of our second year. He was healthy and loud and took after his mother in most of the ways that mattered, the particular stillness, the watchful eyes, the early habit of doing things right the first time or not at all. He also took after her in not wasting words, which I found convenient. The 4 years I'm about to tell you about were the best years of my life up to that point. I know that's what people say, and I know it sounds like the thing you're supposed to say, but I mean it as an accounting of fact. We were poor, mostly. The cattle prices were bad 2 of those 4 years. The work was constant and the winters were long. None of that changed. But there was Thomas in the house and there was Nora, And in the evenings when the work was done, we sat by the stove and she'd read. She read more than anyone I've known, cataloged books from somewhere and read her way through them. And I'd do whatever needed doing with my hands, mending tack or sharpening tools, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and both were good. What came after I'm going to tell you plainly, because I've had 16 years now to put some of the raw edge off it. Nora got sick in the spring of our 4th year. Started as a cough that she didn't mention for longer than she should have, and when she did mention it, she mentioned it the same way she mentioned everything. Here is a fact, here is what I know about it. By summer it was clear what it was. She knew before I did. I think she'd known for months. When she told me, she was matter-of-fact about it in the way she was matter-of-fact about everything, and she had 2 requests. She wanted to see Missouri before she died, and she wanted me to promise I wouldn't stay alone forever. I took her to Missouri in September. Thomas stayed with Dewey Cass, which Dewey was not prepared for but handled with a grace I didn't know he had in him. Nora and I went by train as far as the rail ran, and then by wagon for 2 days. And she sat up straight the whole way and looked at everything like she was committing it to a place where it would stay. We found the farm where she'd grown up, some other family in it now, strangers, but they were kind when I explained, and they let us walk the property. Nora walked the field behind the barn for 20 minutes without saying a word. I walked it with her. I didn't say anything either because there was nothing useful to say, and she wasn't looking for commentary. She was looking at something that was hers and that she needed to see one more time. On the wagon ride back, she said, "I kept my whole life small because I was afraid. Don't do that." I said I wouldn't. She said Thomas needs to see more than Cutter Creek when he's old enough. I said he would. She said, and don't let Dewey Cass feed him pie for every meal. He does that when he's uncomfortable. I said I'd keep an eye on it. She died in November. At home, in the bed we'd shared 4 years, with the first snow of winter tapping at the window and the dog lying on the floor beside her because she'd asked for him. I was there. Thomas was too young to understand what was happening, but he was in the room, and she asked for him to be there, so he was. He sat in the chair in the corner with his hands in his lap, the way she used to sit when she had nothing to do, and he watched. In those last weeks, I found out what I was made of, which is one of the things you find out when you sit with someone who's dying and you can't do anything about it, and you have to be there anyway. I found out I wasn't as good at patience as I thought I was, and I found out I was better at it than I was afraid of. I found out that sitting beside someone and being present without fixing anything is its own kind of work, and it's harder work than anything I've done with my hands. She said to me 3 days before the end, "You're a good man, you know that." I said, "I don't know it particularly." She said, "I know it, that's enough." It was the plainest declaration of anything she'd ever said to me. She said it the same way she said everything, in that flat voice that didn't decorate what it meant. And it hit me the way plain things hit you when they're true, not gradually, but all at once, like a board you didn't see. I said, "Thank you." She looked at me. Her eyes were still clear even then. She said, "Don't thank me, it's just true." I buried her on the rise above the creek where she liked to sit on summer evenings. The stone I carved myself because I didn't trust anyone else to cut her name right. It took me 2 weeks to get the letters the way I wanted them, and I was not a man who worked stone, and I made a mess of the first attempt and had to start over. The second one was right. Thomas was 2 years old. He grew up not knowing her much, which is one of the shames of my life that I can't do anything about. What I did do was tell him about her, not stories that made her soft or saint-like, but real stories, the kind where she was difficult and right and funny and quiet and stubborn and worth all of it. I told him the card game story. I told him about the shirt she'd held for 5 months. I told him she'd been smarter than most men he'd ever meet, and that he should take note of that and not be threatened by it. I think he heard me. Then I was alone again. Thomas and I in the house on Cutter Creek, with a carved stone on the rise above the creek and the dog that had been hers and was now mine. I was 43 years old. I want to tell you about those 3 years between, because they matter for understanding the second story. What I did in those 3 years was what I'd always done, which was work. The ranch ran. Thomas grew. Dewey Cass came by more often than before, and I let him, because I understood now that Dewey coming by was his way of checking that I was still alive inside, and he was right to check. I went to town when I needed to. I attended the church social 2 summers running, which I found pointless but not actively unpleasant. What I didn't do was look for a woman. I wasn't ready, and then the 3 years went by and I wasn't sure ready was something that was going to happen. I'd had something good with Nora. It had seemed, at the time, like more than I'd expected from life. I wasn't sure I had the appetite to start that whole project over again. I kept Nora's books. She'd had a system for the accounts that made sense, and I used it. I kept her kitchen garden, which I was considerably worse at than she'd been, but which I was too stubborn to let go. I finished reading one of her books, a long one about the sea that I didn't fully understand but that she'd had a ribbon in, and I read it to the end because she hadn't gotten to. Those are the small acts of faithfulness that a man does when he doesn't know what else to do. They're not enough, and they're something. I want to tell you about Thomas in those years, because he's part of both stories and I don't want to pass him over. Thomas at 2 had been barely old enough to know what was happening when Nora died. What he had was a vague sense of something gone, and the dog and me. I'd had no experience raising a child alone. My own father had been a capable man but not a warm one, and I'd understood even as a boy that his model wasn't the one I'd choose if I got the chance to choose. So I was trying to invent something, which is an uncertain process. What I did was I talked to him. Not down to him, talked to him the way I'd talk to a person, which I think surprised him when he was small, and which he came to expect when he was older. I told him what we were doing and why. I told him about the cattle and the land and the seasons. I told him about his mother in the way I told you real stories, not stories about a saint. I wanted him to have her in some form, even the partial form. That's all I could give him. He was a serious boy, quiet like her. By the time he was 4, he was helping with small things around the yard, real help, not pretend help. By 6, he could harness the smaller horses, and he understood more about the cattle than some grown men I'd worked beside. He didn't talk much, but when he talked it was worth hearing, which is a quality I've always respected, and which I believe he got entirely from Nora. In those 3 years between Nora and Winona, Thomas and I developed the kind of partnership that a man and his boy develop when it's just the two of them. It's not the same as having a full family. It's something else, quieter, more careful, both of you aware of what's not there. But it's real. We'd eat our meals and clean up after, and he'd sit with me in the evenings the way Nora used to sit. And occasionally one of us would say something and the other would consider it and either answer or not. And that was our evenings. I worried about him, whether he needed more than I knew how to give, whether growing up with only me was making him too solitary, too inward. I didn't have good answers. I did what I could. What I found, and what I've thought about since, is that children are more resilient than men think they are, and also more sensitive in ways men don't always see. Thomas carried his mother's absence in him, but he didn't let it hollow him. He found ways to fill himself up with work, with the land, with the animals, with the books I ordered for him when I could afford them, and which he read the way Nora had read, thoroughly and hungrily. He wasn't broken. He was just shaped by something hard, the way good timber is shaped by the wind that bent it while it was growing. Dewey Cass came by more in those years and brought his wife Ruth sometimes, who was a good woman with a generous nature who tried to fill in some of the domestic knowledge that Thomas wasn't getting from me. She taught him to sew a button, which I genuinely hadn't thought to do. She taught him a few things about cooking that went beyond what I knew, which wasn't much. I was grateful for it, and I told her so, and she waved it off, which is how good people treat their good acts. I went to the church social both summers, and I talked to people, and nothing came of it. There was a widow in Haverford the second summer who was pointed in my direction by well-meaning people, and she was a perfectly fine woman, and I talked to her twice and felt nothing beyond politeness. I didn't blame her for that. I was probably not ready, or I was not the kind of ready that shows from the outside. What I was waiting without knowing I was waiting. The Glenwood Valley in the years around 75, 76 had a situation that the town of Haverford treated the way it treated most things it didn't know what to do with silence and a certain pulling away. About 12 miles northwest of my place, near a stretch of the Forkner River that nobody much wanted, there was a small Lakota camp, maybe 30 people, a group that had separated from a larger band some years before and settled there. They traded in Haverford sometimes when they could. Feed, salt, cloth, small tools. They were tolerated in the narrow way that means people look through you rather than at you. I'd had little reason to think about them one way or the other. They weren't my concern and I wasn't theirs. That's how it was. The second spring after Nora died, I had a mare that had thrown a shoe and gone lame and wouldn't come right. I'd done what I could with her and couldn't sort it. A man named Pollard, different Pollard from the one I'd bought the land from, though possibly related, mentioned in passing that the Lakota camp had a woman who was good with horses. I didn't know what to make of that exactly, but I was tired of watching the mare stand wrong, so I went. The camp was quieter than I expected, clean, well-ordered. There were children and dogs and the smell of wood smoke and something else I couldn't name, maybe dried sage. 8 or 10 adults visible. A couple of the men watched me come in. They weren't unfriendly exactly, but they were measuring, which I understood because I'd have done the same. A man who spoke English came out, understood what I wanted, and took me to a woman. Her name, as near as I could work out from how it was said, was Winona. She was around 30, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness about her that could be mistaken for indifference if you weren't paying attention. She looked at the mare for maybe 45 seconds, ran her hands up and down one foreleg with her eyes slightly unfocused, like she was listening with her palms. Then she said something to the man and he told me, something wrong in the foot. Leave her 2 days. I said I would. 2 days later the mare was right. Winona had worked out a small abscess I'd missed entirely. It was deep set, nothing I'd have found without knowing exactly where to look. I asked what I owed and the man consulted with her and came back with a price that was too low, and I paid double and left. I didn't think much about this for 3 months. Then in August, a situation arose in the valley that I'm going to describe fully, because it's how everything else happened. Corbell Hatch had been the biggest rancher in Glenwood Valley for 15 years, and he ran the valley the way big men ran things in those years, not quite openly crooked, but organized around his interests in a way that nobody had the footing to object to. He had friends in the county seat. He had hired men who were loyal in the way that hired men are loyal when the wages are good and the questions aren't asked out loud. He was not a stupid man. He was worse than that. He was a smart man who'd never been told no firmly enough to believe it. He'd gotten it into his head that the stretch of Forkner River was useful to him. He wanted to push his summer herd up that way, use the river water, rest the herd on the grass. The people currently on that stretch were in the way. He put the word around that the camp was stealing cattle. I heard this from Dewey Cass, who'd heard it from the man who ran the hardware, who'd heard it from someone else. The chain of people was long and the original source was, so far as I could tell, Hatch himself. I didn't believe it, because I'd ridden past that camp a dozen times and I'd seen nothing that suggested it. And I'd asked the 2 men who ranched closest to the Forkner, men named Aldrich and Pierce, and neither of them had seen evidence of it either. In the second week of August, Hatch sent 5 of his riders out to the camp. I only heard about it afterward. The riders hadn't done anything physical, not that time, but they'd made clear what was wanted and what would happen if the camp didn't comply. 5 armed men on horseback in your yard makes a point without words, and the point was made. The following week, word went around Haverford that the camp's trade in town was no longer welcome. A couple of the shopkeepers, the ones who depended on Hatch's goodwill, stopped selling to them. The others just found reasons not to be available. I sat with this for 2 days. I thought about it from different angles, trying to find the angle where it wasn't my business. I couldn't find it. Not because I was a crusader, I wasn't. I had a ranch to run and a boy to raise and very little extra energy for other people's troubles. But because what was happening was unjust in a plain way that didn't get less plain the more I looked at it. So I went to town, bought 200 pounds of flour, 50 pounds of salt, dried beans, lamp oil, coffee, and 3 bolts of cloth, loaded the wagon, and drove out to the Forkner River. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I thought, if they can't buy what they need, somebody ought to bring what they need. That's all. It seemed like the thing to do. Winona came out when she heard the wagon. She looked at the load in the bed. Then she looked at me. I said, I figured you might be running short on some things. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in English that was better than I'd heard from her before, considerably better, we are. She'd learned English from a missionary woman who'd spent a winter at the camp some years back. Learned it thoroughly and kept quiet about knowing it, which I understood immediately and which told me something about her. I helped unload. Some of the camp men worked alongside me. Nobody said much. When we were done, Winona brought coffee and we sat on the step of one of the log structures and drank it. She said, Hatch will hear about this. I said I expected he would. She said, he'll make it difficult for you. I said I was pretty hard to make difficult. She looked at me with a look that was taking my measure and not being subtle about it. Her face was broad and still, and her eyes were very dark and direct, and she did not appear to be someone who confused politeness for truth. She said, why did you come? I thought about it. I said, because it was the right thing to do, and nobody else was doing it. She nodded once, noted, then she went back to looking at the river. 3 days later, Corbell Hatch came to my gate personally. He was a big man, well-dressed for the valley, with the manner of someone who'd had things go his way long enough that he'd stopped imagining otherwise. He told me I was making enemies I didn't need. He told me the situation with the camp was complicated, which was the word people used when they meant, I have decided something, and I'd like you not to think too hard about whether it's right. I told him I'd made do with fewer friends than he seemed to think I required. He looked at me for a moment. He said, you've got a boy. I said, I do. He said, something to think about. I said I thought about him every day, and that thinking about him was part of why I was going to keep doing what I was doing. Hatch rode out. I stood at the gate and watched him go. My hands were steady. I wasn't afraid exactly, but I was clear-eyed about what I just said and what it meant. I went inside and checked the rifle and the shotgun, which I hadn't needed in 2 years, and made sure they were clean and loaded, and put them where I could reach them. Then I went back to work. I went back to the Forkner River camp the following month. More supplies. Over the fall and winter that followed, I went out there maybe a dozen times. Sometimes it was supplies. Sometimes it was to help with something practical, a section of fence, a roof repair, cutting and hauling wood for their stores. I learned about 30 words of Lakota, which the children found funny and the men found tolerantly amusing. Winona and I talked. Not every time and not always much. She was not a woman who made conversation for the sake of it. But she was, I discovered, a woman who thought about things seriously and who, when she decided you were worth talking to, said things worth hearing. She told me once, in the course of a conversation about the valley and what she expected Hatch to do next, that she'd been watching the situation for years. Not just the camp's situation, the whole valley. Who held what? Who owed whom? What the patterns were. She had a clear-eyed read on people that came from spending a long time watching rather than participating, and her read was usually accurate. I told her she should have been a lawyer. She said lawyers weren't available to her. I said that was the valley's loss. She looked at me when I said that, a quick look assessing. Then she said, you mean that? I said, yes. She nodded, looked away. I drove home that day thinking about a woman who had to verify that you meant what you said, because nobody had for long enough that she'd stopped assuming it. The night in February is what I need to tell you about next, because that's when everything shifted. There had been 2 weeks of bad weather, alternating thaw and freeze, the kind that makes the footing treacherous and the fences unreliable and the livestock stupid and nervous. I'd been fixing fence sections for most of the second week and was tired and cross about it, and I'd gone to bed late on a Wednesday after a section of wire kept pulling loose in the cold. I woke at 3 in the morning from a sound I couldn't place. The dog was up and moving toward the door, which meant something outside. I got the rifle and opened up. There was a horse in my yard, tied to the gate post. A roan I knew it belonged to the camp. I got dressed, got the lantern, went out. In the shadow beside the post, Winona was sitting in the snow, back against the fence, a blanket pulled over her shoulders, not moving. My first thought was that she was hurt. Then she looked up at the lantern light and I could see she wasn't hurt. She was cold, deeply cold, the kind that gets past feeling. I said, "What happened?" Her voice was steady. She was reporting facts. Hatch's men had come to the camp the night before, she said. Not just to talk this time. They'd burned 2 structures at the edge of camp. Men from the camp had fired back and there'd been an exchange, and now there was a reason for Hatch to come back with county authority behind him and the kind of numbers that end things. She said the man who spoke English, the man who'd translated for me that first day, had said she should ride to me. I said, "Why here?" She looked at me, just looked at me with those dark, steady eyes in the lantern light and the snow, like the question was simple and I was being slow. She said, "Because you are the only man in the valley who has done anything." I stood in the snow a moment. Then I said, "Come inside." She did. I put the coffee on. She sat at the table and held the cup with both hands, and the cold in her started to come out slowly, the way it does when you've been cold too long. She kept the blanket around her shoulders. The dog came and lay down beside her chair. We talked for a long time. She was clear-headed and precise about what had happened and what the options were. She'd already thought through the possibilities: go to the county marshal, move the camp, wait and see what Hatch did next. She laid them out without drama. I told her my thinking. We disagreed on one point and she explained her reasoning, and she was right, which by now I'd learned to expect. At some point, without having made a decision about it, it was getting light. She looked at the window. She said she needed to get back. I said, "No, you need to go to Haverford and find the county marshal and tell him what happened. I'll ride with you." She was quiet. She said, "They won't do anything." I said, "Maybe not right away, but it puts it on record. When Hatch does something worse, and he will, there's a record, and a record changes what the county can ignore." She studied me. She said, "You've been thinking about this." I said, "I've been thinking about it since August." She said, "Why do you care what happens to us?" I'd been asked that before, or a version of it. What I told Winona was different from what I'd said to others, because she deserved the fuller answer. I said, "I think the people in that camp have been handed every hard thing this valley could put on them, and they've been standing under it. I think that deserves to be backed up, and I think what Hatch is doing is wrong in a plain way that doesn't get complicated the more you look at it. I don't need a more complicated reason than that." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That is the right thing to say." I said, "It's not something I'm saying, it's something I think." She looked at me. Something in her face moved, not much, the way things move in still water when something passes underneath. She said, "All right, we'll go to Haverford." What happened with Corbell Hatch over the next 6 months is a longer story than I'm going to tell in full, because it's more about county politics and the particular way that men who have been big in a small place respond when their bigness starts to cost them, and less about me and Winona than the other part of the story. What I'll tell you is, we went to the marshal and he was cautious and non-committal in the way that men in his position were cautious when Hatch's name came up. I went back 3 more times with more information, and I brought Aldrich and Pierce with me on the 3rd visit, which was the visit that mattered, because suddenly it wasn't one rancher with a grudge. It was 3 ranchers with a consistent account. I also went to the county judge, who was a different kind of man than the marshal, and who had his own reasons for wanting a limit on what Hatch could do. By spring, Hatch had pulled back, not graciously. He didn't apologize and he didn't concede, and he found ways to make things harder for me that winter in small ways I noticed and didn't respond to. But the camp on the Forkner River was still there. He didn't move against it again. That's what mattered. What happened between me and Winona in those 6 months was slower and more real than anything I'd planned or expected. She was at my place more during those months. There were practical reasons. We were coordinating the response to Hatch, sharing information, making plans. But the practical reasons started to thin after a while, and we were still talking. Still sitting together in the evenings when she'd ridden out to bring me news from the camp, or when I'd been out there and stayed too late to make the ride back in the dark, and Thomas would have gone to bed and the dog would be at our feet and the stove would be burning low. She was not like Nora. I want to say that clearly. I mean it as a fact about two different people, not a comparison of value. Nora had been a woman who held things close and let them out carefully, a woman of precision and economy. Winona's stillness was different. It wasn't caution so much as depth. She watched everything and said less than she understood, and when she said something it was because she'd been carrying it for a while and had decided it was time. She knew things I didn't know. About animals, about land, about how seasons moved and what they meant for the work of surviving. She had knowledge that had been built over generations and refined and tested against reality, and being around it made me understand how much of what I thought I knew was actually very thin. She was also funny in a way I hadn't expected. Not broad humor, nothing that announced itself. Dry, quiet, often at the expense of something everyone was pretending not to notice. She'd say one sentence that reframed a situation completely, and then go back to drinking her coffee as if she hadn't said anything. I was falling. I knew it this time, which was different from Nora. With Nora, I'd arrived at it slowly and practically. With Winona, I was aware of it as it was happening, and I spent considerable time thinking about what that meant and whether it was right and whether what I felt was what I thought it was. The world we lived in, that's what I kept coming back to, not her, not me. The world around us, and what it would mean for her to come to Cutter Creek as my wife, and what it would mean for Thomas, and what the valley would do with it, and whether I was asking her to take on something that was mine to carry. One afternoon in July she was at the ranch. I can't remember the reason now, something practical, and we were sitting on the porch, and she said, without looking at me, "I know what you're thinking about." I said, "Do you?" She said, "You're thinking about whether what you feel is real, or whether it's something easier dressed up to look real." I said, "You got that from my face." She said, "I got that from watching you for 3 months." I said, "What do you think it is?" She turned and looked at me fully. She said, "I think you're an honest man trying to be honest about something that scares you. I think you know the answer. I think you're testing it." I sat with that. Then I said, "What are you thinking about?" She was quiet for a while. A real quiet, the kind that meant she was taking the question seriously. She said, "I'm thinking that I've watched men decide things about my life for a long time. Good men and bad men both. I'm thinking that you're the first one in a long time who's asked me what I think instead of deciding for me. I'm thinking that matters more than most things." I said, "It does matter." She said, "Yes." We sat there longer. Then I said, "I want to ask you something, but I want to do it right. Tell me how to do it right." She looked at me. Something shifted in her face, not soft, not dramatic, but real, the way a door opens a 1/4 inch. She said, "You already are." We were married in the fall of '77. Not in Haverford. I didn't want to give the town that event to form opinions about before we'd even begun. We were married first at the Forkner River camp, in whatever way Winona's people held to be right and true, and then the following week the circuit preacher came to the ranch and spoke words over us that covered what the law required. Dewey Cass came to the first ceremony. He stood in the back and looked like a man whose world was being rearranged in ways he hadn't agreed to, and afterward he shook my hand and said he hoped I knew what I was doing. That was Dewey saying he wished me well. It was also Dewey saying he was scared for me, which was honest of him and which I didn't hold against him. Aldrich came to the second ceremony. Pierce sent word that he'd been taken sick, but that he wished us long life, which I believed. Nobody else came, I noticed. I let it stand. What I said to Thomas that night, after he was 6, old enough to understand some of it, was this: that Winona was a good woman, one of the best I'd known, and that she was going to be his mother now if he'd let her, and that some people in the valley were going to have opinions about our family that weren't their business, and that the measure of a man was not what those people said but what he did about his own life. He was 6 years old. He nodded very seriously. Then he asked if Winona was going to bring the roan horse. She did bring the roan horse. What it was being married to Winona, I want to try to tell you right. It was a partnership in the deepest sense, I know. She knew things I didn't know, and I knew things she didn't know, and when we put them together, the result was better than either of us would have made alone. Not always comfortable, not always easy, but better. She took over the north pasture and turned it into something I hadn't known it could be. She had a way of reading grass and water and soil that came from somewhere I couldn't access, and the north pasture, which had been my worst grazing, became in 3 years my most reliable. I had opinions about how it should be managed. We argued about it. She was right more often than I was. I made my peace with that and was grateful for it. She took over the books in the second year because she had a head for numbers that I genuinely envied. Every spring we'd sit down with the ledger, and she'd show me where we stood, and every spring we stood a little better than the year before. She found 3 places where I'd been paying more than I needed to for things I could have sourced differently, and she fixed them. She was not easy. I'll say that too, and I say it as a credit to her. She held herself to standards and held me to them as well, and she was not patient with the particular kind of dishonesty where a man lies to himself about his own limitations. She called me on it twice in the years we were together, and both times she was right, and both times the conversation was uncomfortable, and both times I was better for it. She was steady in the way I've always valued most. Not unshaken. There were hard seasons, years when things went badly, a sickness that moved through the herd in '82 and took nearly a third of them, a summer of drought, Thomas getting hurt badly one winter when a horse threw him, and in all of it she was steady. Not cheerful about hard things, not pretending they were other than they were. Just, here is what is happening, here is what we do about it, and I am here. She and Thomas found each other slowly. He was 6 when she came, and he was watchful in the way children are watchful around things they haven't decided about yet. She didn't try to charm him or push him. She treated him like a person who had things going on in his head and who would come to conclusions on his own schedule. She was direct with him without being hard on him, which is a difficult balance to find, and she found it naturally. The first thing they bonded over was the roan horse, predictably enough. Thomas had been cautious around horses since he was small, not afraid exactly, but careful with them the way you're careful about something you respect, and he'd watched Winona with the roan from the day she arrived. About a week after she came, he went and stood at the corral fence watching her work the horse, and she noticed him there and didn't acknowledge him for a while, and then said, without looking away from the horse, that he could come in if he wanted. He thought about it for a minute, then he came in. She showed him how to read what a horse was telling you with its ears and its weight and the way it held its head, and he listened with the same complete attention he'd always brought to things he cared about learning. They spent about an hour in the corral that afternoon. He came in for supper without saying anything about it, and she came in without saying anything about it, and I didn't say anything about it either, and we ate our meal. But after that, Thomas went to the corral when she was working in it, and she let him be there, and over weeks and months they built something up. By the time he was 8, they had a language between them that was mostly practical, mostly about animals and land and what things meant in the natural world, but real, the kind of language that develops between 2 people who think about the same things the same way and don't need to announce it. She taught him things I couldn't have taught him, how to find water in dry country, what the behavior of birds meant and what it didn't mean, how to read weather 2 days before it arrived, how to move through a landscape without disturbing it, which is a different skill from moving through it efficiently. He grew up knowing more about the land and the animals and the way things work together than I ever will, and that knowledge came from her. And that is one of the things she gave him that will outlast all of us. She told me once, this was maybe 6 years in, a winter evening, Thomas asleep, the two of us at the table. She told me that she had spent most of her life expecting things to be taken from her, that the condition of her life had been that things came and then went. Good things and bad things, but mostly things taken. She said being with me had changed that. I asked her what was different. She said, "You stay." I said, "I stay." She reached across the table and put her hand against my face. Her hand was rough and warm, work-worn, and she held it there and looked at me the way she looked at things she'd fully decided about completely, without reservation. She said, "Yes." I put my hand over hers, and we sat like that for a while with the stove ticking, and the snow coming down outside, and the dog asleep on the floor. That was the reward, right there, that moment, though I didn't have those words for it then. Some of the valley came around over the years. Not all of it, not all at once, but people see a ranch that runs clean and cattle that are fat and a family that holds together and does its work, and eventually the seeing of it overrides the opinions they brought to it. Not for everyone, but for enough. The ones who came around first were the ones who dealt with her directly. A man named Greer who had a sick horse and no one else to call. I'd mentioned Winona's way with horses to him some months before, and when the horse got bad enough, he came to me swallowing his pride, and I took him out to the ranch, and she looked at the horse and told him exactly what was wrong and what to do about it. And 2 weeks later, he rode over himself to tell her it had worked. He stood on our porch and addressed her directly and thanked her. That was Greer, not always my favorite man, but honest enough in the end to do that. The women were slower, most of them. But Ruth Cass had always been decent, and she kept being decent in a louder way once she had someone to be decent to, and Ruth's influence in the social life of that valley was considerable. Things shifted in small ways, not an announcement, just the slow turning of a ship. There were people who never came around. I knew who they were, and so did Winona. She had a precise inventory of who was what and why, and she was never wrong about it. She wasn't bitter. She was just accurate, which I found I appreciated more than any amount of performed forgiveness. She didn't need the approval. She didn't require it. What she required was that I didn't pretend it wasn't happening, and I didn't. One evening in our 3rd year, I came in from the barn later than I should have, tired and rank with the smell of cattle, and she had supper on the table, and she looked at me, and I could see that she'd had a difficult day of some kind. I could always tell, though she rarely said so directly. I asked what had happened. She said she'd been in town, and a woman she didn't name had said something she didn't repeat, and she'd said what she thought about it, and that had gone about as you'd expect. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Don't be sorry. Be glad I said it instead of you." I said, "I am glad." She looked at me. Then she did something she didn't do often. She laughed. A real laugh, short, genuine. She went back to putting food on the table. That was us. That was how it went, in the small daily moments of a marriage. I thought sometimes about the valley's opinion and what it cost her, whether she'd have made a different choice if she'd known exactly how hard it would be. I never asked her that directly because I was afraid of the answer. What I believed, and what I still believe, was that she'd known exactly how hard it would be, and she'd made the choice with her eyes open, and that was her right to make and mine to be grateful for. One Sunday, this would have been maybe 5 years in, we drove into Haverford for supplies and stopped at the general store, and the man behind the counter served her without making her wait, greeted her by name, asked about the ranch. It was nothing more than what he'd have done for anyone. But it was what he'd have done for anyone, and that was new. When we got back in the wagon, she said, "Did you notice?" I said, "I noticed." She was quiet for a minute, then she said, "It's something." I said, "It is." We drove home without talking about it more. We didn't need to. Winona was never pretending to be something she wasn't, never folding herself into a shape other people would find easier. She was who she was, in the post office and the hardware and on the street, and she was so plainly competent and so plainly not concerned with what you thought about it that people eventually stopped thinking about it, which is the best you can usually ask for. Thomas is 20 now. He's taller than me, which came as a surprise I should have anticipated, and he works the land with the same combination of things Winona taught him and things I taught him and things he figured out himself, and the combination is good. He's in the process of taking on more of the operation, which is the way it should go. Dewey Cass died 2 years ago. I sat with him at the end and we talked about a lot of things we'd been too busy to talk about before, and he told me he'd been wrong to say what he said about not knowing what I was doing when I married Winona. He said she'd been good for me and good for the valley, and he wished he'd said so sooner. I told him it was all right. He said he knew it was, and that was the problem. He should have said it when it wasn't already obvious. That's Dewey, even at the end, honest about his own failures. I'm 63 years old. I've got a bad knee that gets worse in cold weather and a good dog that is the third dog since Nora's and is the best of the three, and more firewood than I'll burn and a ranch that runs clean and a son who's going to do something with it. And I've got Winona. I'm 63 years old. My knee is bad and my hands are getting stiffer in cold weather in a way they didn't used to, and there are mornings when I feel every year of the work I've asked this body to do. None of that is a complaint. A man who has worked his land for 40 years feels it in his joints, and the feeling is evidence of something, and evidence is not nothing. I married 2 women nobody wanted. I want to be clear about what I mean by that, and what I don't mean by it before I'm done. I don't mean they were inferior to other women. I mean the town had decided they were inferior and acted accordingly, and the town was wrong, and I was lucky enough to be looking in the right place when the town wasn't. Nora had been worn down by a bad marriage and saddled with a dead man's debts, and the town's comfortable story about why. Winona had been pushed to the edges of a place she'd lived on longer than any rancher in the valley, and Haverford had decided that what was pushed to the edges could be ignored. Both of them were worth more than anyone looking at them from Haverford's vantage would have guessed. What I learned from 20 years with them, what I want to hand to any man who's decided the good ones are taken, who thinks he's too old or too tired or too ordinary for something real, is this. A woman of genuine worth will not always be where you're looking. She'll be somewhere she had to be, doing what needed doing, not asking to be seen, not performing, not waiting to be discovered in a pretty way, just working and living and accounting for herself plainly. And if you have the sense to stop, and the patience to look at her as she actually is rather than as the world has decided she is, and the steadiness to still be there in the cold and the hard seasons, and the mornings when nothing is easy, then sometimes, if you're lucky, she'll look back. I was lucky twice. Last night after supper, Winona stood at the window beside me, and we watched the snow come in over the north pasture, her shoulder against mine, the dog at our feet. She slid her hand through my arm and leaned in just slightly, the way she does, and we stood there watching the snow come down on a pasture she made into something neither of us could have made alone. 14 years of that lean. It's not a small thing. There's a carved stone on the rise above the creek, where Nora used to sit. There's a good woman's hand in the crook of my arm. The ranch runs clean. That's the reward, that's all of it, and it's everything.